Hey everyone. Today, we're going to unravel the story of how we study politics. And trust me, it's a fascinating journey that's been going on for thousands of years, all driven by a battle between two really different questions.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The entire history of political science, when you boil it all down, is about this one major conflict. Are we trying to figure out how government ought to be, chasing after justice and the perfect state? Or are we trying to figure out how it actually is by studying what people and countries really do? This is the fundamental tension, the big drama we're going to explore.
And our story kicks off like so many do in ancient Greece. Now, the earliest thinkers here, they weren't trying to build a science of politics. Nope. They were on a philosophical quest, and they were laser-focused on that first question, what ought a perfect society to look like?
And the first big name on our list is Plato. In his famous work, The Republic, he wasn't really concerned with the messy, day-to-day politics of Athens. Instead, he was trying to design the perfect society from the ground up, a state built entirely on the ideas of fairness, order, and philosophical truth.
And right at the heart of Plato's perfect state is this incredible idea, the philosopher king. For Plato, the only person who was actually fit to rule was someone who didn't even want the power. Their qualification wasn't money or military strength, it was a deep, genuine love of wisdom and truth. I mean, this just perfectly shows his focus on creating a morally ideal state.
But then, along comes his student, Aristotle, and he kind of looked at Plato's ideal vision and said, that's nice, but let's take a look at the real world. This is why he's often called the father of political science. Aristotle did something that was absolutely revolutionary for his time. He collected data. He went out and studied 158 actual city-states to see what made them work and what made them fail. He was the first to really get serious about studying politics as it is.
Of course, getting from Aristotle to where we are today was a long road. For centuries, that push and pull between the ideal and the real just kept evolving. The Renaissance, for instance, shifted the focus away from pure morality and more toward the practical, sometimes gritty use of power. Then the Enlightenment came along and brought back these huge philosophical questions about rights and society. And all of this finally led to the late 19th century when political science officially became its own field of study in universities.
This moment, right here, this shift from the medieval period to the Renaissance is just huge. You had thinkers like Thomas Aquinas who were still trying to create a moral government, one that blended politics with religious faith. But then, Niccolò Machiavelli basically crashed the party and changed the game forever. He pretty much said that for a leader, being effective and holding on to power is way more important than traditional morals. This was a massive leap towards studying the pragmatic reality of politics.
So this shift towards realism, started by people like Machiavelli, really set the stage for what was coming in the 20th century. Because at this point, the pendulum didn't just swing, it swung hard towards the scientific study of what is, kicking off what would become a genuine revolution in the field.
Before this big shakeup, the study of politics was, well, traditional. It was mostly descriptive, focusing on the big formal things like constitutions and laws. It was philosophical, always asking about justice and the best kind of state. At its heart, it was still very much in the spirit of Plato.
Then came the behavioral revolution of the 1950s and 60s, and this was a radical move against that old traditional way. Scholars basically said, okay, enough talking about what's good or best, let's start studying what people actually do. They wanted a pure, value-free science of politics, looking only at behavior you could actually see and measure.
And you can see just how different these two worlds were. The traditional folks were asking, what is the best government, and using philosophy and history to find answers. The new behavioralists, they were asking questions like, why do people vote the way they do, and using hard data, surveys, and statistics. It was a complete and total transformation of the discipline.
The behavioralists basically had a new set of rules, a creed they lived by. First, they believed you could find discoverable patterns or regularities in how people behave politically. Second, every idea had to be backed up by evidence you could actually verify. Third, they relied on precise quantitative tools like stats. And maybe most importantly, they tried to be completely value neutral, to keep their own personal beliefs separate from the facts.
But, there was a problem. In this race to be purely scientific and value-free, the field started to feel a little disconnected from the real world. A counter-reaction started brewing. one that argued a science of politics that just ignores urgent social problems isn't really doing its job.
And that leads us to post-behavioralism, a whole movement that was summed up by two powerful words: relevance and action. The whole point was pretty simple. Knowledge is great, but it should be used to make society better. Now, this wasn't about throwing science out the window, not at all. The post-behavioralists said, yes, let's absolutely use data and rigorous methods, but let's point them at the big, important problems. They argue that researchers actually have a responsibility to deal with issues like justice and inequality, and that a totally value-free science wasn't just impossible, it wasn't even a good idea.
So, after this whole historical tug-of-war between the philosophical ought and the scientific is, where exactly does political science stand today?
What we have now is this really cool synthesis of the entire journey. The field still has a place for Plato's big questions. That's political theory. But it fully embraces Aristotle's scientific legacy in fields that study the world as it is. Comparative politics looks at how different systems actually work. International relations studies how nations interact. And public administration looks at how policy is really put into practice. And it's all powered by political methodology, which gives us the advanced statistical tools to really understand the is. Both sides of that original question are finally working together.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. The great thing about modern political science is that it can mix the ought and the is. It can use hard scientific methods to take on deep ethical questions. So the question for all of us now is, what's next? What's the most urgent, real-world problem that this powerful combo of philosophy and science ought to tackle?